SIFS Young Seminars. Today we will have, as usual, two speakers, Luca Razzoli and Prajwal Padmanabha. I hope I pronounce correctly. Okay, we will start with the latter. Let me introduce Prajwal with some few words. Prajwal is a final year PhD in the Lab of Interdisciplinary Physics in Padova, under the supervision of Amos Maritan and Sandro Addaele. His main topics of research are the theory of non-equilibrium system with a focus on absorbing boundary systems and the application of theoretical tools to ecological questions. The title of the talk today will be Emergent Encoding of Dispersal Network Topology in Spatial Population Models. So please, Prajwal, you can start sharing and speaking.
All right. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay.
Please, I ask you to stay within 25 minutes.
All right. Yes. Can you just remind me when it's about 20 minutes in case
it's not that simple because I have to interrupt you. I have to hand. So better if you look at your watch.
Okay. So let's try it in the morning. Is the presentation visible with the changing of the screen?
Yes, yeah, it's okay. It's okay.
All right, perfect. So hi everyone, I'm Prajwal. I'm a PhD student, as Dr. Corberi just introduced. Today I'm going to be talking about a recent work that we finished on how to encode network information in metapopulation models. So the brief outline of the talk is going to be, I'm going to present a bit of context as to why we need to, what is metapopulation, why we need to look at it. I'm going to introduce some historical models and how these were analyzed previously. This is going to take about half the time, and the next half of the time I'm going to try and explain how we sort of generalize these historical models to also include explicitly the underlying network information and how this can help us introduce other landscape properties into metapopulation models. So to start with the context, mostly in theoretical ecology, especially which has been a field since the last century, most of the dynamics focuses on what happens locally. What I mean is you can have a set of species in a forest, let's say, and you can look at what is the birth rate of a given species, what is the death rate, and you can try to analyze this through different approaches. Some of them are what you might have seen called Lotka Volterra systems or consumer resource models, a neutral theory which uses explicitly the stochasticity in the rates. But all of these processes look at the dynamics at a very local scale. But one important thing is that these species reside in a landscape, and there is an inherent link between what happens to the species dynamics and what is present in the landscape. And even in some cases, what happens to the landscape can be influenced by the species. So you can have this sort of feedback loop where species influences the landscape and landscape influences the species. To just give a picture, here is a map where there's plotted different species that occur in a given topographic area. And it is very likely possible that here, although animals have been shown, especially if you look at plants, it's possible that different elevation levels can be occupied by a certain specific species of plant, which means that you will have a very patchy landscape that occurs in. So for instance, there could be a species that occurs only at the top, which means that it will exist on this part of the landscape and these high-lying regions, which means whatever happens in the middle is essentially empty land for the species. So you need to take into account what is the landscape that these species are residing in to be able to accurately predict what happens at the global scale. This is what leads us to metapopulation models, which just means that instead of looking at a single population, we look at population of populations. So how do we do this? One of the basic models that started off in the last century is where, let's say, to simplify things, I'm going to assume that there are a certain set of patches, which could be, for instance, islands in the sea. And each of these islands has a given population of a species on it. So now I'm going to take this entire set of islands and I'm going to ask the question, if I denote by P the proportion of occupied islands, what are the dynamics that occurs on this set of islands, this network of patches. So there are two key processes. One is a set of processes that lead to eventual death. It could also include birth processes, but let's just say that we only look at effective death. And then there could be immigration, which is basically the transfer of an individual of the species from this patch to another patch. So it could happen if it's trees. It could happen that they give rise to seeds, and the seeds travel dispersed through air, and then they give rise to a new plant on another patch. So when you take into account these two processes and you try to write an effective model of what happens, then the dynamics looks like, so the change in the proportion over time has a component that comes from the death and then has another component that comes from the immigration. And this is fairly simple to solve also for the time dynamics, but eventually what you can look at is whether the steady state is 0, where p is equal to 0 or p is not equal to 0. And it happens that p is not equal to 0 is controlled by this ratio of these two parameters, which denote if this is greater than 1, then it always goes to extinction. If it's less than 1, then the species is able to persist on this network of patches. This was called the Levine's model, which started in about 1960s. But the key thing is that if you look at these equations, these are very similar to what we observe in statistical physics, which is the contact process, where essentially you have the mean field contact process, to be precise, where you're looking at the proportion of occupied or infected nodes in a given large set of nodes, where now the ratio E over C is equivalent to the recovery rate lambda, or the infection rate lambda. So yeah. But what happens if we want to go beyond mean field? What does that mean is that this exists with a given network in a real landscape. So there are multiple links between that happens here, and there's each one link between each set of patches. And essentially, there are still the same processes that is happening. On a local scale, there is an effective extinction that species can die out. And then there is a colonization process that can happen from another patch to this focal blue patch, for instance, only when it is empty. If it is already full, then we don't really care about what is happening. The only process that can happen is extinction. So if we write the dynamics, again, the extinction can be modeled somewhat very similarly, is that with a constant rate, the proportion keeps going down. But for the colonization, let's say that I'm considering this orange patch. What is the effective colonization from this orange patch to the blue patch? So if I look at this, the edge that connects these two patches on the network, since it exists in a real landscape, I can make an assumption that it comes with an inherent distance. And the colonization rate effectively decreases exponentially with distance, and there is a characteristic scale alpha. And then the colonization rate also has to depend on the proportion of species that exists on this patch. So when you combine this over all possible patches, you get some sort of a kernel, which depends on all the patches, and then the proportion of the contributing patch. We still can get somewhat similar result that I was showing before, which is depending on the ratio E over C, what happens. Where now we define something called a landscape matrix, which takes into account all these exponential distances in the landscape and the characteristic scale. And what it turns out is that there's one single number, which is the maximum eigenvalue of this matrix M, which is termed as metapopulation capacity, which determines whether the species is able to persist on this network of patches or can it go extinct. So this was pioneered by these two people in 2000s called Hanski and Ovaskainen. And the good point about this model is that there's only one number with which you can take into account all of the processes and tell whether a given species is going to go extinct or it's going to survive. And this had huge successes, especially in trying to understand from data whether you can, a priori, if you're given a habitat of patches, can you say whether a given species is going to survive, and what happens if you start fragmenting those species, fragmenting that landscape. But there were a few problems with this. One is, what is the origin of the colonization? Specifically, this assumption that it decays exponentially with distance is a very reasonable assumption. But what is the origin is one question. The second is distance the only information that is needed? What do I mean by this is, if I'm considering distance as the only landscape information, note that I need the entire habitat to be fully connected. Although the weights along these edges can be very different, but the habitat by itself has to be fully connected. So if I want to say that, okay, maybe I have a different sort of structure that is connecting these habitats, which can happen. If you remember the landscape topography map that I'd showed with the species on it, if I'm only considering two mountain peaks, then in between, if there is a river, it's quite likely that a species cannot cross that river. And those two mountain peaks and then are not necessarily connected. So if I'm giving you a network which is not fully connected, what happens to the model by Hanski and Ovaskainen? And the third is, now if I change this network over time, which is a key point in terms of deforestation, in terms of how humans are having an effect on the ecosystem, we lose the assumption of fully connected network. So to take into account all of these, what you would need to do is start adding more ad hoc assumptions to this model. But instead of doing that, if we are able to start from the basic microscopic processes, then it is quite likely that we can incorporate these processes on top of the network rather than adding ad hoc assumptions at each step. So what do I mean by that is, we separate the processes. We say that there are a set of local processes that happen, and then there are a set of dispersal processes which occur in conjunction with these local processes. But these dispersal processes then come with their own network structure, come with the network information, through which then you can incorporate what is happening in the landscape. So there is one layer of what we call a settled population. Now, these you can imagine are the patches, are the islands in the sea, the habitat. But then there is another layer for the dispersal network where another, let's call it an entity for now, an entity called explorers that move around. To connect this to something real, the settled population can be trees on an island and the explorers can be seeds. So the trees then give rise to the seeds, and the seeds are then move around because of there could be birds that are taking it around. There could be a wind that is moving it around. But then when these seeds eventually reach the patch, then they give birth to new trees, which is good. But with these processes, especially let's say that for the local processes, we start off by modeling explicitly extinction. We can add on multiple processes, but for simplicity, we go with extinction. And then, like I was saying, these trees can give rise to seeds. Here we keep the giving rise to seeds very general. So one tree can give rise to a seed in any of the patch. Then we can modify how this interacts with the network later. Once the seed is given, takes birth, then it can move around with a given dispersal rate and something that depends on the underlying network. And once it reaches a patch, then these seeds can settle and turn into trees. But because we have these set of microscopic processes, we can start employing tools from statistical physics. What do I mean by that is, I can write down the master equation for this. Then there is an explicit system size that enters into these microscopic rates, which is the size of the patch that we are looking at. And then we can do the one-Kampen expansion, which leads to a Fokker-Planck equation. From here, if we take the large patch approximation, we essentially get an equation for the means. From this equation for the means, we can assume that there is a separation of timescale that is happening. What does that mean is some process, because there are these multiple processes, each of these processes come with its own timescale. And if these timescales are far apart, that is, some processes happen super fast and some processes are very slow, then you can sort of get the average effect of certain processes on the total dynamics, which then leads to effective deterministic dynamics. So this separation of timescale in this problem essentially comes from the fast explorer dynamics. What I mean by that is that if the explorers are diffusing very fast, or the seeds are dispersing too quickly compared to how fast the trees are giving birth and dying, then you will get something that effectively resembles an all-to-all connection. So let's say that even though the underlying network started off by being very random, not fully connected, when you have this sort of effective deterministic dynamics, you get an all-to-all connection. And notice that the effective all-to-all connection more or less looks like there are connections between all-to-all patches, but it sort of looks like, for instance, these two patches are far apart, so the link is not as strong, whereas these two patches, which are much closer, have a stronger link. So we somehow see that there is a distance dependent weightage of this complete uh, network, which is what we were looking at initially. So if we do how does this deterministic effective equation look like, is where once again, the density of a species in a given patch has some extinction dynamics or death dynamics. And then there is a colonization dynamics from all the other patches. Just to remind you, the equation that we were looking at, which is the classical metapopulation equation, looks from Hanski and Ovaskainen, looks exactly like this. But now the exponential with the Dij is now replaced by this dispersal kernel, which is very general and comes from some network that we have chosen, which is the dispersal network for the explorers. But what is this kernel? So the goal was to try to incorporate network properties into effective metapopulation model. So how does this kernel depend on the network? Well, what you can say is it turns out that the spectral properties of the dispersal network explicitly enter into this kernel. So now in this model, we end up with a new parameter, which is the efficiency of the explorer, which is a ratio of the dispersal rate to the settlement rate. And the kernel, when, for instance, if I'm taking a 2D grid as the underlying dispersal network, turns out to have these multiple components. Specifically, you see that the adjacency matrix of the underlying grid enters into the kernel. So what are these terms denoting is the adjacency matrix to a certain power denotes the number of paths of a given length between two nodes. And there are going to be multiple paths between two nodes at a given length. There can be multiple paths. So each of these paths comes with a certain path weight. And you see that the denominator here is greater than the numerator because all of these terms are positive. So the path weight, as you start increasing the length of the path, keeps going down, which means that it turns out, because of this property, that the summation over all possible paths, which are effectively infinite, gives a convergent result. And all of this is modified by a species modulating factor that depends on the explorer efficiency. But effectively, this kernel then can be expressed as a weighted sum over all possible paths in the network. And because we're looking at all possible paths in the network, we are sort of taking into account all the properties that a given dispersal network has. So essentially, it sort of is because between two given nodes, you can have two different paths of the same length. So you have some sort of a path entropy in the system. And this derivation of the metapopulation model accounts for these path entropic contributions. So now you no longer have between I and j, it's not just given by an exponential decay between the distance of the distance between I and j, but rather it's somehow takes into account all possible distances between two patches. And because we haven't really made any assumptions in writing down the model, you can start off with an arbitrary network. You will still get a fully connected network, but now with these path entropic contributions, the dispersal mechanisms is known, and then you can start to add additional processes. You can start to change the network in time. You can start to add properties to the network through the adjacency matrix, and all of these goals that we had outlined before are possible now. But before we proceed, the key question then is, where is the exponential decay coming from? So let's say that we consider the underlying network to be a ring, which is somewhat similar to a one-dimensional line. then it turns out that we can show exactly that this, if I look at the kernel between I and j at a given network distance dij, it decays exponentially with this network distance. And this is an exact scaling. So we can map what is the efficiency of the explorer to the characteristic dispersal scale that was used in classical models. And this is not really surprising because a ring network, which is effectively one-dimensional, and if we consider the processes that we were looking at, it's essentially stochastic resetting. And stochastic resetting in one dimension gives an exactly exponential steady state. So the key assumption of the classical models was that the dispersal or the colonization mechanism was somehow probably happening through stochastic resetting. But then the dimensions were being conflated. So the results from one dimension were being used in arbitrary dimensions, which is, or effectively, because in real space, then almost 2 dimensions. But what happens if I start with other heterogeneous networks? Let's say we have some classical small world networks from Barabasi Albert, where you start increasing the heterogeneity, then you start increasing the width of this kernel. So more heterogeneity in the network gives rise to more heterogeneous couplings that you will observe. And this ends up having an effect on the persistence, which was the question that we were looking at, whether things go extinct or whether survive. Whether they survive depends on the network structure, and certain network structure then has a better persistence compared to a random network structure, let's say. But what can we do with this, let's say, in the real world? If I give you a topographic map, here there is a river that is running through, and then there are these terrains at different height levels. And if I compute what is the height, then it looks somewhat like this, where the darkest blue follows the path of the river and the white is the highest points of this. On this landscape, as you would expect, going uphill is sort of harder than going downhill. And this you can encode as a weighted adjacency matrix of the underlying landscape. And if you let a species evolve on this, it turns out that depending on the efficiency of the explorers, a species can explore the landscape to different extents. So I'm going to play a movie where you see that the highest efficiency sort of disregards the differences in the height, because if an explorer is very efficient, it doesn't matter whether the dispersal is happening downhill or uphill. It's almost equally good. Whereas while the efficiency is not as great, then the majority of the occupied places are the low-lying areas, because going uphill is much, much harder. But at intermediate efficiencies, this is exactly the structure of the population resembles what you would expect from the topographic map. And not just that, if let's say that you had a uniform rainfall across this area, this would give rise to a channel network of where you can track how the water is flowing down. And at intermediate dispersal efficiencies, it almost exactly resembles this channel network of flowing water. And while I've given the context broadly in ecology, because the model that we have written down is essentially is fairly arbitrary. The assumptions are that what we need is that there are different types of populations. That is, there is one layer of local populations, and there is another layer where a different type of population is allowed to move around. And this sort of can then be mapped onto different areas as well, where now the explorers can be, let's say, chemicals or proteins which are moving around. And the settled population could be, instead of trees, could be cells, which then take in these chemicals and proteins and then express it in a certain manner or change their state. Or equivalently, they could the explorers could be viruses or infected people, and then the settled are susceptible people, which then links this to epidemiology, or also to information theory, where you can look at what is happening in a social network where information is moving around in a given network. And settled population, here I've just given examples of phones or computers, but also could be any other arbitrary non-mobile entity. And also it applies to urban mobility, where you can look at how people are moving across cities, and cities are the settled densities, and cities are the settled population. So the potential links that you could draw from this abstract framework seems to be, there seems to be many potential possibilities. As a summary, we started off from some historic models and had some questions about how they were derived. And we sort of know now what sort of assumptions were there underlying in those historic models, and a much more rigorous explanation of this metapopulation model, which now can include heterogeneous networks and landscape information. The significant strength of this approach is in the method, because a lot of these results that we have seen, also there are some more results which I have not talked about in the presentation. These results could be obtained from different theoretical ecology models. But here we are starting from the same model, but by changing whether the underlying network is different, or certain properties of the nodes are different, or the species parameters are different, we see that they give rise to the multiple results that were previously observed through different models. And all of this is in our latest work in PNAS, which was released last month. And you're welcome to check it out. If you have questions, feel free to email me or any of the other authors, and would be happy to have a chat. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prajwal. So is there any question? Maybe I have one.
Yeah.
I don't see hands raised, so I do my question.
Okay.
Because it was very clear and very interesting, but you didn't show many results. So
yeah,
I have, for instance, a curiosity. So depending on the kind of dispersion that you have this matrix.
Yes.
So how does this population grow? Does it remains more or less uniform, or there are cases where it segregates into sectors?
That's a very good question, because essentially,
because sometimes when I go in the mountains, you see that there are trees staying alone. Okay.
So here there is, in terms of this, let me go to this one, which is already an image, where I was showing it with the landscape. There is some segregation happening here, you see, which is happening because of the dispersal matrix, how we are changing the dispersal matrix. But equivalently, one could also think about changing, because each species can have different properties in different parts of the landscape. And if that happens, then you will more explicitly see segregation. Whereas here you are already seeing segregation that is happening because of dispersal. So it depends on what parameters of the model we are taking. Let's say if I go to the key equation, which is here, then in this equation, if I keep the extinction rate constant and the colonization rate constant, the dispersal enters through the kernel. And just by changing how the dispersal occurs, I can already get segregation. But if I can equivalently also do some other limits where I keep the dispersal constant, and then I can change around what happens. And this will also potentially lead to segregation as well, which we have not observed, which we have not looked at here, let's say.
Okay, thank you. I see there is a question by Johannes.
Hi, I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
All right, good. So first of all, thanks for the presentation. I just have a question of interest. So at some point during the talk, you mentioned that the effective dynamics basically takes place always on a fully connected network. Did I understand it correctly?
Yes.
So what does this mean for, let's say, when my network is now disconnected? Right, because I cannot see when my network, like my dispersal network, is disconnected, that the effective dynamics happens on a fully connected network. So I can see that, of course, yeah, with the paths and everything, it works out if it's like sparsely connected or whatever, or not directly connected, let's say. But how does this work when you start playing with like disconnected and these fragments and things?
Yeah. So the assumption that we had was that this underlying layer of dispersal is connected. But if you have a disconnected underlying layer, then you're going to have the disconnected components being fully connected. So there's not going to be a connection between the components, which is reasonable, because if you do not have a dispersal connection between different parts of the network, then you cannot expect to have an effective connection between those parts as well. So in this image, if let's say I disconnect these two lines, then these two links of the Explorer network, then I'm going to have a fully connected dynamic between these three and between these two, but no interlink between these two parts of the network.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Thank you.
Is there any other question? I don't see any, so thank you, Prajwal.
All right.